Hello and welcome to this week's Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly current affairs programme with me, Emma Webb, and this week I am joined by Peter Whittle, the director and founder of the New Culture Forum. So there's been a lot in the news this week, but before we begin, Peter, would you like to tell viewers a bit about the event that's coming up?
Yeah, thanks, Emma. We've got an event coming up on the 3rd of October in Birmingham. It's during the Conservative Party conference, but it's on the fringe of the Conservative Party conference. And we have speaker Nick Timothy, who's been on the channel. He's a columnist with the Daily Telegraph, but obviously quite famously he was Theresa May's chief of staff. And it should be a good event. It's the first of our what we might call local events that we're going to be doing. And so if people watching are in the area and they watch NCF and they subscribe to the channel and they want to come along, then please do just register your interest via it's contact@newcultureforum.org.uk. Because it has to be by RSVP because we've got limited space. But it's the Monday the 3rd of October, and basically we'll put that in the link under this video. But if you get in touch saying I'd like to come, then we'll make sure we can make space for you. So, but thought it'd be worth saying because it's only a week or so away. So,
shall we begin then by talking about what's been going on in Leicester with this, what looks like basically sectarian warfare on British streets between Hindus and Muslims?
Well, it is, isn't it? Sectarian warfare. It seems to have come about from originally from a cricket match and sort of escalated, and there is now a concern being voiced in the newspapers that this is actually going to spread to other cities, and in fact indeed in Birmingham it already has. And I think really that what is interesting about this, Emma, I don't know what your view is that the general emphasis will eventually, I feel, become about social media and the effects of social media. In other words, anything to distract from what I see as being the main issue, which is imported problems. Why, in God's name, why should we be having to deal with sectarian issues from another part of the world? This is appalling, and the fact is that nobody in mainstream politics, apart from people like Claudia Webb and the Labour side, who's actually chosen to start talking about the far right or something in this occasion, totally ignoring what's going on. But this started to happen throughout the time when of the Queen's funeral and just before. And it shows a parallel society.
Yeah, it's amazing how, like you were saying with Claudia Webb, how affactual a lot of the commentary has been. Yeah. And so Douglas Murray and Calvin Robinson both made the point that basically that if you import the world, you import the world's problems. And like, I agree with you completely. I think the clear direction that this is going to go in is this is going to be fuel for the fire for the online harms bill, this online safety bill, which will basically get online, the big tech companies, and we'll talk more about that later in relation to what's been going on with PayPal, but that these big tech companies will be encouraged to censor things online, particularly misinformation. And that's interesting because that's something that anybody who's interested can look at Hardeep Singh's articles in The Spectator and in Spiked.
Hardeep Singh,
and he's pointed out how misinformation, fake news has been part of this. For example, the Muslim community believing that a Muslim girl had been kidnapped by a Hindu man.
Right.
But it's going back to this issue of sort of sectarianism. Charlotte Littlewood from the Henry Jackson Society, she gave a really interesting analysis of this situation on GB News, which is totally unlike anything anybody else has been saying, and is actually sticking to the facts as she can see them on the ground, because a lot of people have been saying this is to do with, in the broadest sense, what's going on abroad is being played out on the streets of Leicester, Birmingham. We've seen this before. When anything goes wrong in Kashmir, there's always tensions in the community here. And she's pointed out that through her own research, which is ongoing right now, she's looking at what people are talking about on social media and in the various chats that are going on within the community, that it seems to be a sort of a territory dispute, which I think is very interesting. A territorial dispute in a majority Muslim area, where the Hindus were apparently marching sort of in protest against the attacks that they had experienced through putting up their own religious symbols, and that is what has led to the conflict in this specific circumstance that has been triggered by this cricket match. And so it's very interesting that, you know, to stick to the facts on this, that this isn't about what people are saying online, although it may be a factor in it. This is about what happens when you have a multicultural society where serious conflicts, and I'm interested to know what you think about this. When these serious conflicts are triggered, it reminds me of Northern Ireland. And I see this playing out very much as Northern Ireland has, where you have these communities that are in this sort of territorial dispute, and Hindus being made to leave the area or feeling pushed out of the area and then returning and feeling they can't put their symbols up because they may be attacked and things like that.
But we shouldn't even have areas. You know, people should not be subjected to areas.
The talk of a territorial dispute is extraordinary.
Exactly, and in fact, online there have been. I've seen a few of the more radical people behind this, or at least talking about it. There was one Muslim guy, and he was talking about bring your boys. He was talking to
it's the same as what happened in Batley, where they invited people to come from outside of the area. More radical Islamists possibly, inviting them in to get them to go out on the streets. And some of these scenes are people walking around in balaclavas, wielding weapons, and you see this little thin line of police officers, a lot of them female, trying to keep these two communities apart when they're brandishing knives and all they've got is batons.
But you see, that's all they can do in a way. I mean, the fact is that the political class, the governments of whichever stripe, are not willing to take this on. The fact is, you say it's multiculturalism. Yes, it is. It's multiculturalism is one, and then the other side is sheer numbers. If you allow into the country the kind of numbers that we have over the past 10 years, this is kind of inevitable.
Well, it's a fundamental failure of integration as well. If you have areas that are majority Muslim and then an area next to it that is majority Hindu, that can't mix with each other. And I think there's a point that has been sort of made to me privately, that you get this, often you see in the news about gang warfare and things, but there are cultural elements in a lot of these conflicts that are playing out on the streets of London, all across the UK, because people are bringing with them to the UK political and personal and family conflicts from back home.
Also, the other thing as well is that people who come in such numbers, there is no need to integrate, first of all, because you've got ready-made communities there speaking the same language. There's absolutely, even a few years ago, there was a kind of initiative to get people to at least speak English. That appears to have gone. Even Labour took that on at one point. I'm talking like 10 years ago now. That seems to have gone. But essentially, you've got huge numbers, do not need to integrate. Plus, you have got a cultural establishment that doesn't really think you should integrate. I mean, that for years, they've been saying, well, we are terrible, we are awful, all the things we've done in the world are wrong. We quite, don't be like us, we're terrible. That's been the message.
It has no sense of, in addition to flagellating what exists, it also has this lack of a sense of self. So even the British values that are being promoted, have been defined, are about as watery and as weak as they can be. And it's because they are trying to accommodate so much within those values that there's no sense of any positive understanding of our national identity that people might, it's funny that as well, so I was going to say that people might want to integrate into, but also that this was going on whilst you were seeing these extraordinary scenes in London in relation to the Queen lying in state and the sort of pageantry around the funeral. And for many people this was binding, this feeling of how absolutely extraordinary this, the constitutional monarchy is. And that is a real vision of what, in a more fundamental sense, we are as an identity, as a nation, in terms of its symbols and so on. Yes. But at the same time, there's something quite symbolic about the fact that in Leicester that this warfare was basically playing out.
I mean, the thing is, it's one of those things that people don't really like to say, and indeed, I don't actually. But the fact is, when you look at those groups of mostly young men fighting and the civil disruption in these places, the Queen doesn't mean anything to them. I mean, she just doesn't. And you then have to say, well, actually, how far has this whole experiment been a success? I think it's been, on the whole, disastrous. I don't mind admitting. But the fact is that we can sit here, and viewers often say this. They say, well, you sit there and talk, and in fact we agree with every word, but what are we going to do? The way things are at the moment, it is actually up to a government to do something. Mm-hmm. So they could start maybe by even commenting on this. Tell me if I'm wrong, Emma, but I don't think I've heard a single government minister say anything about this particular trouble that we're having at the moment.
I haven't, but it might just be that I've missed it, which is possible.
No, I don't think there has been. And this is extraordinary. And it's almost like we are now accepting that this is going to be the case. And I think, as Douglas Murray has said in his piece, this is not the first time. We had it in Oldham. We had it, for example, when the MP was murdered, if you remember, not that long ago. And at that particular point, again, the argument came about social media and things, and what should we do? And at the same time, it will, you have to realise that this is going to happen more and more. Mm-hmm. And if you say that, people say, well, oh, you're just stoking things up. Why? No. It's just, you've got to face reality.
What did you think of the sort of the left-wing commentariat saying things like, this is our, or not just in this instance, but generally in instances like this, saying, well, this is our fault because of what we did in India and Pakistan and Kashmir, and that we are responsible for carving up these countries, and this is a post-colonial problem that we are to blame for. And it's that
so they're admitting it's a problem. So this is interesting. Well, they're actually admitting, on the one hand, this is meant to be wonderful and hugely strengthening this diversity. On the other hand, they're seeing that obviously it is something bad that's happening.
This is it may be Douglas who made this point. I can't remember, but that's a good point. And that narrative implies that, in a way, this is our punishment for colonialism. So these communities and their conflicts and their presence here, they regard as a kind of punishment for
just such rubbish. I nearly said a bad word there. This is such rubbish, Emma. I mean, we have a huge Somalian population. There are Somalian gangs, for example, in London. There have been in the past. So far as I know, that was never part of the British Empire. It is obviously, people who read The Guardian and the left are obviously going to take that view, and it's always going to be our fault somewhere or other. But what I find interesting is that they obviously think that this is bad, what's happening. It's just that they choose to sort of say that somehow or other, it is our fault. It's nothing of the sort. Where I feel particularly strongly is that these disputes and cultural differences are being visited on the people of this country, and they had no say whatsoever in what has essentially brought it about. Mm-hmm. They're having to deal with it. Mm-hmm. They're having to deal with it.
Do you,
it's the cultural side of globalization, if you like.
I am not convinced that you were saying a government has to step in and do something about this. I know this sounds bleak and this sounds sort of Peter Hitchens level of black pilled, as they say, but I am not convinced that you can do anything about this now, and that this is. I'm interested to know what you think, whether this is going to be like a kind of Northern Ireland situation where the territory is disputed in some way. God knows how you fix that, but that it's something that could play out for 100, 200 years, these communities in conflict like this, because I mean it's been over 100 years of conflict in Northern Ireland, and that is still something that flares up now and then. So it seems to me that is the only route that this can take, and in those, other than to make efforts to integrate people from these particular areas, it's the like you were saying, you know, the density, the idea that you would have territorial disputes because you have majority areas that are a particular culture that are in conflict with the majority neighbours in the neighbouring area, and that those have religious or cultural conflicts from back home that have basically been imported, that there isn't really very much that you can do about that other than,
well, you can stop importing it. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's only so far I think you can go with the Northern Irish comparison, because it was in a kind of awful way, it's organically kind of part of our history. But I think the fact is that this will only grow whilst you have 300,000 people legally coming to Britain, let alone illegally.
The other dimension to it as well is that it basically makes us vulnerable and beholden to politics that are playing out around the world. So whatever happens in any of these countries, and you can see how that could easily be weaponized by a foreign government if they were not an ally, if they are able to basically trigger and fuel conflicts within the UK.
Well, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it, and a bit humiliating that I think it was the Indian government called for us to actually calm it down. I mean, what the hell's going on? I would say,
and they are an ally.
Well, what I think is actually far more pertinent is that, for example, what about our policy in relation to Israel? I'm a huge supporter of Israel. And you can see that in the future, if something very, particularly bad blew up in terms of Israel, a government here would be thinking, how is this going to play with our Muslim population?
Mm-hmm. I think probably that's already a consideration.
Of course it is. But I mean, at the same time, supposing push came to shove and we had to show some kind of support, there would be this kind of, calculation going on.
So I mentioned PayPal in the context of big tech, because this is probably going to go down, like I say, the route of fueling the online safety bill, because politicians will argue that it's bad words online that have caused this to happen, rather than actually addressing the real complicated on the ground problems, and actually, as Charlotte Littlewood has done, looked at the facts.
They're really not that complicated. This is the point. I mean, I'm not being pedantic here.
More complicated than just simply saying everything is to do with what's going on online.
Oh yeah, that's just pure distraction. That's pure kind of displacement activity.
But so moving on to the subject of big tech. This week, PayPal have closed down Toby Young's personal account, swiftly followed by the account of the Daily Skeptic, which Toby runs, and also the Free Speech Union, also run by Toby. Yeah. And that was followed by Us For Them, which is a parent group that campaigned against schools being closed during the pandemic.
Is that in America?
Here in the UK. Okay. And a whole host of other organisations like the Law or Fiction lawyers who were campaigning against vaccine mandates, Gays Against Groomers, which is a gay online campaign against paedophilia. So a whole host of groups have basically removed their accounts. And this obviously will play into everything around the online safety bill. But what's really worrying about this is that it's basically financial cancellation is the new is the new weapon against dissenters. This ability for big tech, because especially if we're going to go into, we're hurtling towards this cashless society, that we will now be so beholden to these tech giants that they'll have such an enormous amount of power to wield against anybody who dissents from the orthodoxies that they, as the tech giants in Silicon Valley, permit.
Yes, I mean, do you use PayPal for anything? Do you use it yourself? Or?
I have a PayPal account, but I haven't got a clue how to use it.
Well,
so
we do.
No.
I mean, people are viewers, people who support the NCF.
I'd be very happy for PayPal to get rid of my account for me. That would be grand.
Right. They make donations through PayPal, and in fact, some people online advise that if you have a balance in PayPal, just to immediately kind of transfer it into another account, because essentially you lose it when this happens.
Or they hold on to it. So so in other occasions where this has happened, basically, they are able to seize that money as damages through you having used their platform in violation of their policies. Yeah. So they basically steal that money from you.
But it's only happening one way, isn't it? It's happening one way. It's happening to these kind of groups who they probably perceive to be conservative in some way, or the wrong side of the argument.
In the US, I think it, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong on this, but I think that PayPal have closed down accounts of left-wing groups in America who have criticised Biden's policy on Ukraine. So it's people on both sides of the political spectrum, but who are dissenting from some kind of orthodoxy.
When we had the Smith lecture here, Nigel Farage gave the first one. This is in 2018, and it was all about shadow banning, and it was all about the effects of censorship in social media as it was then. As you say, this is quite new. This is financial. This is a way of basically cutting off people's life supply, their lifeline.
Well, it stopped with the Daily Skeptic. I think it was a quarter of their revenue. It halted, and a third of people who pay to the FSU through PayPal. So a third of the members couldn't make those payments because they were using PayPal as a result. So even though the Daily Skeptic and the Free Speech Union will survive and they'll be fine even though they've taken a hit, it's besides the point, because it suggests that basically what we're doing, and in return for having the convenience of a cashless society, just before coming here, I thought how ironic it was that we're about to talk about this, and I actually paid for a coffee where there was a big sign up that said, "We have gone cashless." And so for the sake of convenience, we've all made this sort of deal with the devil. But we're just handing over all of this power to these big tech companies. And once everything goes online, and there's been talk this week also about in America and in India and the EU as well, asking Amazon to basically create a digital currency. So in all of these countries, there's this move towards digitalizing everything financial, everything going online, everything going cashless, having trial runs in the use of biometric data, so your smile or your fingerprint can be used to pay and things like that. I don't know whether people realise the degree to which they are just blindly handing away their liberties, because if you have physical cash, that's something that is a kind of safeguard on your freedom to make transactions. That you can't really be fully censored with the threat of financial ruin. Whereas if everything is going through PayPal or through these big tech giants, and that is basically, you're dependent on that for your ability to transact, then they have the final say really over what you are and are not allowed to say or think or express.
But interestingly, you say people have willingly, given this up. They willingly gave up their privacy, for example. If you go right back to the early days, with Facebook and things, right up to now, it's extraordinary.
People will do anything for convenience.
Anything for convenience. But also, I think younger people, older people, obviously, including myself, I think it's appalling, the idea you won't have cash. But I think younger people see it as, they have bought into the illusion of freedom. They think all these choices lined up, about how you can pay or not is about freedom, as you say, and convenience. And I think they're very mistaken. I mean, I think the point with the PayPal situation is what indeed can a government do about it. I mean, we're talking about the online safety bill, which I think was originally called the online harm bill, by the way. But there are certain ways that they could actually do that. I mean, for example, I think the point was made by Fraser Nelson in the Telegraph today. I think it's a very good point. He said, look, you know, the government can't completely regulate, for example, the housing or renting market, but it can certainly say it is illegal to discriminate against people on the basis of race, religion, or creed. You know, and that's the law of the country, quite rightly. So why can't we do it in these cases?
The bill they should be passing is to prevent these companies from discriminating against people.
Exactly.
But I do think that there is a problem with this idea of this was in Fraser Nelson's article, this idea that we need to protect diversity of opinion or protect diversity of thought. Now, I agree with that in terms of the ends of protecting those things, but I feel like by phrasing it and framing it as another diversity, I think that in a way is its own Faustian pact, because this is not about having more diversity of thought or more diversity of opinion. This should be separate from that. People have a right to those things. It's not one thing among other categories that people should be not discriminated against for, if this makes sense.
Absolutely.
And so I think it worries me that we're now in this situation. We saw this actually with the Maya Forstater case, that she was found in a court that her gender critical rights were protected under the Equality Act, that they were protected philosophical beliefs. But that's also a problem for me, because that implies that those beliefs that are based on facts are themselves protected philosophical beliefs. And so in order to defend ourselves, we're now in this position where we're having to use the language that is already rigged against us. And I find that very worrying.
No, I think superbly put, Emma, there. I think I totally agree with it. Also, it's sort of too fundamental just to be something along with these other things. Very fundamental, something we never even thought. Perhaps you could, and this is a bit of a counsel of despair maybe, but you have to sort of almost say, well, actually that is the situation that we're having to deal with, so that we've got to take that, we've got to use that, we've got to use their language, if you liked, for that. But I totally understand. But the fact is, this thing that's going through, the online safety bill, where this could actually at least be changed, or either get rid of that bill or at least hugely modify it. I believe that Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, has said nothing about this. She has said nothing about any of this.
I think Kemi and was it Rishi, perhaps Penny Mordaunt as well, they made some statements about it. But Liz Truss puts herself forward as being a sort of free speech warrior. But if she really wants to do something that matters, nipping this online safety bill in the bud, particularly because, going back to what we were saying about the whole issue of misinformation and fake news, if we remember during the pandemic, Talk Radio, for example, had their live stream taken down for a period of time.
People forget this.
And that was because the policies of these tech companies, in many cases, their definition of misinformation, which, by the way, there is an arbiter for what counts as fact and what counts as fake news in all of these circumstances. And in those cases, YouTube, for example, they were relying on local and national public health positions, basically. Things that turned out to be a U-turn further down the line, and actually those things that were misinformation were no longer misinformation because they had become accepted. And so you're manipulating the public debate if you allow these companies to have the power to be the arbiter of what we can discuss publicly, and also even in terms of shadow banning, to decide, what things should be prioritized or which things should be demoted. And it's the same as the discussions that are going on at the moment to do with the ESG scores, the environment, I think it's environmental, social, and governance. That again is libertarians, free marketeers, people like Liz Truss should be talking about this, because that is a manipulation of the free market. It's an intentional manipulation by these huge corporates to manipulate people's behaviour and to manipulate, and they believe they're manipulating people's behaviour in aid of what is good, and to manipulate the public debate.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, you could say whether they intend to or not, but it seems that the purpose is almost transparently to try and change the things that people can express and the things that they can't.
Well, on this point, again, in this bill, online safety bill, there is this utterly insidious new definition of something which is harmful but not illegal.
Yeah.
Now, what is that? Harmful but not illegal. That, I would say, could cover 50% of human discourse.
And who decides what's harmful as well?
Exactly. Can you imagine the police getting hold of that?
Well, it's not too different from the non-crime hate incidents,
Well,
isn't it?
exactly.
Again, it's the same as a
thing.
non-crime hate incident.
It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing.
Let's, I was about to say, let's move on to something lighter, but maybe...
Trying not to be gloomy. We're trying desperately not to be gloomy.
Yeah, let's move on to something lighter. Let's talk about obesity.
Lighter, ha ha ha.
Boom, boom.
A heavy subject.
So the Telegraph this week had a comment piece in it, and it was entitled, "Only Systemic Change Can Save Britain from an Obesity Epidemic." And this was something that you'd said to me, Pete. So I'm just going to go and summarise for the sake of those watching or listening what these sort of the basic stats were that this article was basing itself on. So firstly, a number of studies that have come out in the last couple of weeks. 80% of the UK population will be overweight by 2060. And this
80%?
80%. Wow. Unless I've taken that number down wrong. I think it's right.
No, I think
it does
right.
seem rather large, pardon the...
Yeah, 80%.
But, costing the economy 142 billion. That Britain is in the grip of an early onset cancer epidemic, with rates of colon, kidney and liver cancer going up, and that in 20 to 40-year-olds, and that this is likely to be due to the consumption of junk food, and that women with type 2 diabetes die on average 5 years earlier than those without it, and men 4.5 years earlier. And the argument in this article, which there's a lot to unpack here, the argument in this article was basically that it's not about individual choice, and that the government, like Liz Truss, for example, she's very much against the nanny state. I think that's fantastic. I completely agree with her on that. She wants to get rid of, I think, the sugar tax and things like that. The argument in this article was against that view, and that instead it's not about what individuals do, it's about systemic change in the food production, in there she puts it, the food system, so that the food that we have now in comparison with the food that we had in the 1950s is just so much worse in terms of how much fat and sugar and all sorts that it's got in it, that there's not really anything the individual can do, that it's something the government have to force food industries to make systemic change. But what I thought was so interesting in here is the two things. Firstly, this reminds me of the whole COVID narrative, that we're now addicted to talking about how many years earlier people die and the numbers and statistics and so on, which is a very, I think, a very inhumane way of looking at health. Because people make certain choices, and maybe those choices have impacts on and on the length of their life or the quality of their life, but maybe for them personally, when they weigh those things up, they'd rather have a cigarette or they'd rather have a burger and live a slightly shorter life perhaps. But also this idea that now that we really are sort of putting at loggerheads individuals and the system. Everything now is about individuals versus systemic change. You know, the same with the race narrative around racism, that it's not, or even climate change, it's not something the individual can do. It has to be something that changes within the system. But this is this kind of amorphous utopian thing.
Yes, I mean, I would actually take more, I'd take the approach you took when we were talking about the problems in Leicester. When you were saying, I don't quite see what we can change about this. It's not anything the government can do. It's not this. I would take that approach to this problem. I mean, there is a problem, obviously. You can just tell. I mean, if you've lived long enough, fat people, kids or whatever, in the 1970s when I was a teenager, were kind of quite rare, and they would be basically mocked. Now, that is, I had it myself because I was a chub ball, right?
Hard to imagine.
And, and I certainly had that on the wrong end of that. But at the same time, it was kind of rare. And you say, well, it's not fair to mock people. Fine. I do think people have changed. I mean, there's something, one of the articles that you might actually be quoting from there. I remember that the author of the article, I think it was in the Telegraph, was sort of blindly said, is this because people have changed? Of course not. People have said, well,
people have suddenly lost willpower in the last 50 years.
It's not even just willpower. I think it's what it is that there's a kind of indulgence. I can tell a lot of people will probably disagree with this. It seems to affect certain sections of the population more than others. I think Ferdinand Mount wrote a brilliant book called Mind the Gap a few years ago, and it wasn't specifically about obesity, but it was along the same lines. We're getting to have two classes of people now, a bit like in the Time Machine at H.G. Wells, and you've got the kind of professional classes who are, fit and slim to the nth degree, which on their whole they are, and what you would have called working class people who are more overweight. It's more of a social thing, and this is kind of going to grow and grow, and there's a moral dimension. These people are morally correct and puritanical, and these people are not. And obviously one hates that kind of comparison to be made, but I do think
but it also feeds this nanny state elitism as well, because I think they think that there's this attitude of, well, we're superior to these people and we need to control what they eat because they don't have the ability to do that for themselves. Because I agree. I think that, I have sort of listening to all this stuff about seed oils and things, and started looking at the backs of packets, and the amount of total crap that is in most unnecessary ingredients. And obviously there's this whole movement towards trying to eat cleanly, and that can be very difficult because it's actually hard to find things like bread, for example, that doesn't have loads of junk in it. But at the same time, I think it's more than just about the food system. It's also that since the 1950s, you've got more women in the workforce, and so people not preparing their own food at home, not having somebody whose job is basically to take care of that aspect of a family's life. You have more people who are atomized, and so it's harder to eat healthily when you're living on your own, because it's easier to shop and to cook for more people, and to do that affordably and in a way that is healthy. And you also have people who have far more pressures on their working life and in their careers than they did in the 1950s, and that's something that has increased. And so now things like Deliveroo have grown up, and there's a market for people just being able to push a button and get food delivered to their door, and that food is obviously not as healthy as food that they would cook at home. So there are all of these other aspects, but I just, it's this distraction, I think, from willpower. Like, you can still make an effort to eat healthily. And when Lee Anderson did that speech in Parliament and was absolutely slated for it, the Conservative MP, who's from a working class background, stood up and said that he thought that it was good that there was a group in his constituency that were doing this basically charitable work, helping people who use food banks learn to cook healthy meals on a budget, because it's genuinely very difficult to do that. It's a skill to be able to do that, and he got completely slated for it.
Yes, but the funny thing is, it's interesting, he was slated by the left mostly, right? Because he was a Tory, and and in fact,
they were calling him a toff, even though he's distinctively not a toff.
No, they're never going to win. But there are elements of what he says is right. I think it is a cultural change which is going to be very hard to reverse. First of all, we do know, right, that, for example, grazing, i.e. eating at various different times throughout the day, is terrible in terms of putting on weight, i.e. it makes you put weight on, right? So people do that. People walk along, eating in the street, all that, it's become part of life. It's everything.
Partly, also, I think, because people are so busy, they feel like they need to fit it in where they can. No, I don't think it's just business,
no. People just want to eat it then and there. I think people have
culture with no delayed gratification.
No, they have more leisure time, Emma, than in fact ever they had. And in fact, people were very slim when they actually were working very hard. take my mum. She worked in a shop, and where we were going to school too, but she still, cooked at night and things like that.
But could that be because it's more people are doing more sedentary jobs, more desk jobs?
More sedentary, but also people don't eat together. Mm-hmm. Right now, this has been proven as well that you come together at say like 6 or 5, whatever it was, for your dinner or tea, as we used to call it, right? And you have basically that structure. Everything is structureless now. So just in the same way that people, for example, have televisions, the kids watch something in the bedroom, the parents watching something downstairs, all of that. It's the same with food. Children are indulged hugely, right? So it used to be, that's what we're having tonight, steak and kidney pudding, peas and potatoes.
Eat it or go hungry.
Eat it or you won't, blah, blah, blah. Now it's, oh no, but young Tarquin can't eat this and young Delilah can't eat that and it doesn't like that, blah, blah, blah. So it's all much more indulgent in that way. But so those are the sorts of things that start to make weight gain. And also people drive everywhere. We used to walk to school, they drive everywhere now. The kids just popped off at school and everything. But I think that what's interesting about this, Emma, is that food and the consumption of food, even though we're getting more and more obese, it has never been more central to our whole culture. It is the way in which now food is our main creative activity, I would say, if you want to call it creative. Cities are judged on how much different cuisine they have. Cities are judged, their dynamism is judged on how many cafes and restaurants there are, not on who's painting what or who's making what music. It's actually how many people are going to eat out. If you look at the pandemic, the whole thing was, what was it, help out?
Eat out to help out.
Eat out to help out, shocking phrase. And then on top of that, you sort of, you have, even we were talking about multiculturalism, even food is now used as a massive kind of reason to celebrate multiculturalism. Oh, look at all the different restaurants we have. If you take that out of the equation, then you say, well, look, come and tell us about multiculturalism, but please don't mention food. Then you find there's a bit of a silence in the room. So food has become sort of central at the very time where basically people are.
But don't you think, though, that what you're describing there, that this whole argument that we have to change the food system is really, to use a horrible phrase, disempowering? Because actually what you're describing there is a cultural problem, and a cultural problem is in the hands of the people. Yeah. We can make routine changes to our habits and the way that we live our lives, and that's the way that you rescue a culture, by doing the culture.
Well, no, but this is it.
And if we behave differently, then yes, we might be up against it in terms of the fact that a lot of our food has got all sorts of rubbish in it. But it's just simply by making those changes that would solve a lot of the problem, because there are, yes, we do have a lot of people in this country who are obese, but there are also some people like yourself, Peter, who are not. And it means that it is possible to be, healthy and not obese, eating the food from this system. And so if everybody learned to live by better habits, and for that to become a culturally enforced thing rather than Deliveroo being the culturally enforced thing, then
I couldn't agree more. Look, if you live in, I live on, first of all, the other thing, 8 million people live on their own now, I think it is, something like that. That's a sure way as well of eating irregularly and badly. And I fully see that. But like in my flats, where I was living before in London, you'd get Deliveroo coming in the morning, with various breakfasts and all. What's the matter with you? Get up and make a breakfast.
And one of the worst things I ever did was getting the Deliveroo app on my phone.
Oh, really? Right. But I mean, honestly, it is. I think it is something that people can actually do themselves. As you say, it is the cultural aspect. Kids are going to school now not being able to use a knife and fork, for example. People really do not know what certain vegetables are, much less cook them, right? And this is not a class thing. The culture is not being transmitted in all sorts of ways, which we endlessly discuss on this program, but this is one of them.
And this is pretty fundamental. Well, this has really been a counsel of despair. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please, despite the despair, do tune in next time. Like, subscribe, tell us what you think of the topics and the show in general, and we will see you next time on Newspeak.
Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.